Bem, bom dia a todos. A gente dá continuidade, então, ao nosso programa. Agora a gente tem a segunda conferência com a professora, a doutora Edel Bhreathnach. Dr. Edel Bhreathnach is an esteemed scholar in the field of Irish history and archaeology. She has worked extensively on various topics, including the Hill of Tara, the nature of the Irish historical tradition, Irish Franciscans, Irish monasticism, and death and burial practice in early medieval Ireland. Dr. Bhreathnach is also had held also like the position of Tara Research Fellow at the prestigious Discovery Program from 1992 to 2000. Following this, she served as a postdoctoral research fellow at the Moore Institute in Galway, later also at the Michelle O'Clery Institute at the University College of Dublin, where she subsequently became deputy director and academic project manager in 2007. In 2013, she assumed the role of CEO at the Discovery Program, a position she held until recently. And among some of her extensive publications, we can find The Kingship and Landscape of Tara from 2005, The Irish Franciscans from 2009, Ireland 14 to 1000 AD, Landscape, Kingship, and Religion from 2014, and most recently, like Monasticism in Ireland, which is expected to come out still this year, I think around September. So, Dr. Bhreathnach, thank you so much for accepting this. Please, you have the floor.
Well, first of all, thank you. Unfortunately, I can't respond in Portuguese. I wish I could, but I will say Goramila Mahagav in Irish. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a topic that I've been looking at from various angles with all the different projects I've been working on about women in Ireland, in early Ireland. So I hope that you find something of interest in what I have to say. So I think we're on slides. So if I can go to the next slide. Yes, the following slide. Yeah. So when we think of women in early Ireland, quite often we are confronted with women from sagas such as the famous Queen Medb of Connacht, the mythical woman, the woman who's associated with kingship, and of course a character who comes down through the ages, down to even Anglo-Irish literature, and as you see from here into the modern period, as an icon of feminism, as a war goddess, as a goddess of fertility. But somehow perhaps this lady does not really represent what real women who lived in the period, and when I'm talking about a period, I'm talking about from about 500 to 1200 in the paper that I'm giving you today. So we'll put Medb aside. Please, next slide, please. The other woman who, of course, dominates quite often, especially with the coming and development and spread of Christianity, of course, is the Virgin Mary, who does appear, as you find here in the Book of Kells, with a very well-known image of her, which is probably based on Byzantine art or imagery. And in this case, she, of course, is seen, especially in ecclesiastical circles, as the perfect woman. She also more and more becomes the intercessor between not only women, but men as well, of course, especially as we go towards the 12th century and when we have the greater influence of, say, the Cistercians and Bernard of Clairvaux's 12th century adoration of the Virgin Mary. But she is there throughout the whole tradition. Again, the perfect woman, so perhaps not the real woman or the lived experience, shall we say, of a real woman in early Ireland. Next slide, please. And of course, the great abbess, sometimes thought of as goddess, which is a big discussion at the moment, as we have decided that this year is the 1500th anniversary of the death of Brigid of Kildare, the most dominant saint, female saint in Ireland, whose cult spreads all across the continent to Italy, Germany, Belgium. And here we have, for example, a 15th century statue of Brigid from Cologne in Germany. Again, she is, in a sense, the perfect woman from the point of view of sainthood. She is also, and her monastery, highly powerful, very powerful, and we will see how powerful one or two of the abbesses of her monastery at Kildare. Probably, if we can say, as you know, in comparison to Medb, the goddess and of literature or of saga, and the Virgin Mary, probably we can say that Brigid does reflect in some of the miracles and the versions of her lives, of her life, that she probably does actually, in a sense, reflect some of the concerns of real women who lived during the period. And certainly with her miracles, we'll see in a minute how they may reflect, for example, the economic activity of women in early Ireland. Next, please. Now, I always start with an idea for when I'm talking to people about any topic on early Ireland, about our sources, because we are really blessed in early Irish studies with a wonderful range of sources, both in Latin and in the vernacular in Old Irish. Some of them I'm sure you have come across, and some of them are quite, shall we say, standard across all written materials of the Western and indeed Eastern world. When I say Western and Eastern world, of course, we're talking about from the Middle East to Ireland, that world that we deal with. Annals or chronicles, which really start historically to be reliable from, I suppose, the late 6th century. So from about 550 onwards, we can say that some of the material in the annals are reliable, or is reliable. The annals come or were originally put together in major monasteries such as Iona in Western Scotland, Armagh, Kildare itself, the Church of Brigid, and also in the south in Emly. So you have a common, and Clonmacnoise, of course, in the Midlands, you have a common collection of references, but you then have regional additions, or you can see a regional bias in various annals. The annals start off in Latin, but very quickly move to being written in the vernacular. And of course, what the annals, the Irish annals, record are the deaths of major churchmen, the deaths of kings, occasionally of queens, and also then events, particularly battles and the rivalries of various royal dynasties throughout the country. Now, I know that Elaine Pereira Farrell, who is with you, has worked and is the expert on the penitentials. Again, penitentials coming from various cultures, various backgrounds or contexts in Europe. For example, the Visigothic ones, you have Anglo-Saxon ones, a lot of them with similar concerns, similar sins, so they're the classic sins, but not necessarily dealt with in the same way. We also, and this I've worked on the genealogies quite a bit, we have a huge corpus of secular genealogies and of saints' genealogies. And included in those genealogies, which go again as far back or are reliable, I suppose, from the 6th century onwards, we have the dispersal of knowing people from all over Ireland right back till then, and of kin groups and dynasties. Some of them are very reliable. Some of them are not at all, because as dynasties climb up the ladder and become more powerful, they create their own ancestors and their own more prestigious genealogies than where they originally came from. But it is a huge source for us working in early medieval Irish studies. Saints' lives. I know that some of you are working on hagiography in saints' lives. Again, a large corpus. The earlier ones mainly in Latin, so the lives of Patrick, the lives of Brigid, obviously Adamnan's life of Columba, which is sort of the great life that's written in the late 7th century. And of course, the lives, as I always say, the lives are like an archaeological excavation with a stratigraphy that sort of you have to work your way down from the last revision of the life, which could be late medieval, right back to the earliest. And you can see elements or try to, well, generally date parts of the lives based on the interests of the church, the saint's church, how the saint is presented, who the kings are that the saint is dealing with, and such topics. So as I say, you almost have to excavate the saints' lives to work out when the different versions might have been written and rewritten. We also have a huge collection of vernacular sagas and tales, a lot of them involving women, like Medivh, and a whole panoply of different female characters. Most of them a combination of native stories, native characters, native beliefs, mixed in with Christian beliefs, biblical themes, and so on. So they are very complex, and they do get written and rewritten, which shows an interest right down to the early modern period in the sagas and the tales. That great tradition is kept by a professional class of historians and of a learned class and of poets who write or revise and keep the tradition alive. I should also say the laws. I've skipped over the laws. We have, in fact, 7 volumes of untranslated diplomatic edition of the secular laws that cover everything from inheritance, marriage, and I think Deborah Hayden will be talking about some of these in relation to women, the care of sick people, sick maintenance, bees, the law of neighborhood, how land is divided out. So really a great picture of society. Originally, again, probably written down circa 700, or at least some of it, constantly being updated in the sense of glosses being added, so marginal notes being added. And then we have the church or canon laws, again, very much influenced from law within the church anyway, but also with Irish synods where different issues were discussed. And then from the point of view of women, 2 sources that people sometimes forget about, the Bán Hanachas, the tradition or the history of women. So a text that explains who the important women of Ireland were up to around 1200, who their fathers were, who their mothers were, who they married, who their sons were. So it's very much the mother and wives of the great dynasties, but a wonderful resource in the sense, especially when you get into a historic period, of understanding alliances between kings or enmities and conflicts between kings. And I'll show you an example of that, how a woman can be central to that. And finally, archaeology. In the past, I suppose, 20 years in Ireland, because of infrastructural development, sometimes very controversial. But anyway, we now have a system where before anything is built, you have to get an archaeological assessment. So roads, large scale building, schemes, anything like that, the archaeologists have to assess. And if archaeology is found, it has to be decided whether to fully excavate or to record. And it can be controversial, as I say, but it has yielded a huge amount of archaeology, field archaeology and excavations, which is giving us more and more information about the actual lived lives of people, as opposed to what the lawyers would have said in the secular laws or canon laws, saying this is how it should be. What we are now finding is that we are encountering the real people on the ground. A lot of it through burial, and I'll come to burial towards the end. Okay, next slide, please. So just an overview of early Irish society and what people had to confront during the society. And I should say from the very beginning, the society is not static. The old view was this was a tribal, rural, static society. What we now know is that it is not, that things change all the time, different influences, different economic factors. So you have big things like Christianity coming to Ireland and what that does to even to the dynastic power base of the country, how new dynasties come to the fore with the coming of Christianity. Constant shifting of power, really. You see it in the annals all the time and in the genealogies. So you have dynasties rising to the top and then an inevitable fall and decline of others. And you can see the church and them playing with one another. In fact, some of the dynasties taking over the major churches and then losing out as another one comes to the fore. But anyway, well, your status was based on where you stood according to the law. So what class you belong to, what grade you belong to. So a basic division was free and unfree. And within the free, you went all the way up to provincial kings, and the unfree down to slaves. And of course, your legal status depended very much on that, if you had any legal status indeed. And then who was above you? Who ruled you? And most people were ruled by somebody, by a local lord or king, or who then was subject to a regional king or a provincial king. So Ireland was divided up into these many kingdoms. So when we come to the beginning of our evidence, there are many, many kingdoms from local through to the highest provincial, with the provincial kings trying to get their hands or be regarded as the King of Tara, the really most prestigious title in Ireland. But we see as we go along through the centuries that there's a consolidation in kingship. Fewer kings are more powerful, to the point that by the 10th century, certainly into the 11th century, you're down to provincial kings competing with one another for the title King of Ireland. Very, very few of them actually managed to hold the whole island. It's very difficult to do that. And to hold the whole island, you had to be able to gain the tributes or taxes of all the other provincial kings and the kings beneath them. So that was very difficult. Although we do see, and particularly with the coming of the Vikings and the Norse, that kings more and more had standing armies and could travel around with their armies, and military tactics changing and becoming more efficient. We have a church that, again, we don't have formal bishoprics, but very strong bishops, and then very large, what I call ecclesiastical settlements. So you would have Glendalough, Armagh, Clonmacnoise. And within these settlements, you have a whole different type, a range of a population, from the hierarchy, who would be the abbots or lay advocates, so people who are in charge of the lands of the monasteries. You would have the labourers on these lands. You would have a bishop or multiple bishops, and you would have a small monastic community. So in the case, we always call them monasteries, but in fact, only a small number of them had actual communities following a regulated life. And among them would have been women. You also have a lot of royal women who come, and men, kings and queens, who at the end of their lives come to these big monasteries and die there, probably for various reasons, for the salvation of their souls, but also because these places would have had hospices and they would have been cared for as towards the end of their life. Now, this is very important. The economy is very much an agricultural economy and craft-based economy. So you have tillage. Obviously, you've got cattle, sheep, pigs, all of that range of agricultural activity. Then you have things like metalworking happening quite a lot in the ecclesiastical settlements, but also you find them on the in settlement sites as well, which are not ecclesiastical. Milling, things like that, grinding of corn. So the focus of settlement, as far as we can see now, until the 10th century, was on what we call ring forts, stone forts, and cronogues, which are lake settlements, and then large ecclesiastical settlements. And we have a big issue about, are these settlements, especially the ecclesiastical ones, can we call them monastic towns? But I won't go into that. Things change then when the Vikings settle and the Norse towns come to the fore. And then we begin to see the Dublin and Waterford and Limerick especially in the hands of Viking and Norse dynasties, but trading inland and also being a huge part of the Norse or the Viking trading network. And that's where we get references to slaves and slavery. Okay, so we move on from that general gist of what to the next slide, please. So I have just taken one example of what could happen to a poor wife if she got caught up in some feud, of which there were a lot, because there was a lot of small-scale endemic violence going on all the time. At least that's what we can see from the annals. So in this case, I didn't take a king. I thought it would be more interesting. In 1119, we have a reference in the Annals of Ulster to a Cú Colchaile ó Bailán, who is chief poet or Olive or learned man of Ireland in poetry, alms. So he's obviously giving out alms to the poor, or perhaps giving it to one of the local churches or a greater church. Honour and general compassion to weak and strong. He was killed by the men of Lurg and Tuaroha. So obviously there's some conflict going on between this major learned man and these people of a region around where he is. But he's not the only one killed, but his wife and his two sufficiently good sons. Obviously, somebody's writing this who are not too keen on this family, with 35 others, both household and guests, in one house on Low Saturday, 5th April, the feast of Bogán, son of Cúla. Now, this is very interesting because here we have a very good snapshot of a household of an important person, not a king, but a high-class professional at the height of his career. He's an Olive, so he's a chief poet. And he has his wife and his family and his household, the 35 others, plus not just his household, but probably his kin, because there's the household and the guests, and they're obviously having a feast on the feast day of the local saint. And you can see what happens is that the unfortunate household is attacked by these men of Lorgan Tuaroha, and they're all killed. Now, I picked that one out because it's a snapshot, but you find that quite commonly, and not just in the early medieval period, but right down into the late medieval period. The annals continue to describe such attacks on houses and the killing of a whole family. So this kind of endemic, conflict is going on. And of course, women really get caught up in this kind of conflict. Next slide, please. Now, I just thought I'd show you for a minute, just to go away from the text, what we're talking about, where the poet and his household might have lived. First of all, you have in the green, lovely green field, what we call a ring fort, of which there are thousands in Ireland. Some of them like this, what we call a uniballet. So there's one surrounding enclosure defending it. Inside would have been houses, round houses, as they call them, with thatch on top. This would be a fair-sized farmer's household, or where they would live, and they would probably have had around it pens and places to put their animals, and also other spaces, what I call women's spaces, as we will see, to do weaving or grinding of corn or whatever. Some of them can be very spectacular in that they would have what we call multi-vallet ring forts. They would have 2 or 3 enclosures for defence and protection. And we normally read that as meaning that they belong to yet an further up the line in the hierarchy, a local king or even a provincial king, and some of them are quite spectacular, as you will see down in the stone fort, the bigger picture, which is from the Aran Islands, Dún Crochúr. But why I picked that out is just to show you how defended this type of stone fort, mainly 8th century, but continued in use, some of them right down to the 12th century. Probably the main person living on the island is living in this, highly defended, carefully defended. You can see inside the remnants of stone huts, which again, some of them could have been pens for animals. Some of them lived in, although these ones are quite small. And of course, they were, because they're stone, they're built and they're rebuilt. And then outside, a field system. Again, in the Aran Islands, where you have stone structures and stone landscape, those field systems survive and are reused over and over again. So that's the stone fort. And then up at the top where the water is, the Irish National Heritage Park. This is difficult enough to see, but this is a reconstruction of what we call a cronog, or a lake settlement. So throughout the Midlands especially, you have a lot of lakes, and people built these lake settlements with bases to keep them almost afloat like rafts, and most of them would be linked to greater mainland ring forts, and they would often be the site again of royal dynasties where they would have resided at certain times of the year. A lot of very high class metalworking coming from these cronogs in excavations. So they are the centre of craft industries, and also you begin to find objects that are to do with weaving and with let's say dairying, butter, making butter and so on, because the organic materials survive in the wet environment. Then you do begin to find a lot of objects. And finally, the 2 enclosures here of and there was a third, of the great monastery of Nendrum in the north of Ireland, in County Down in the northeast. This was a very important early monastery. It kind of fizzled out from the 10th century onwards. But what archaeologists have shown here is that you have an industrial milling industry being worked on the tide of the estuary on the sea, and this is really industrial scale. So they're obviously trading in flour or in corn, and presumably a lot of people, a lot of the farmers are dependent on whatever they give to Nendrum, and Nendrum is also probably taking a tax of corn so as to be able to keep their industry going. Of course, the Vikings attacked this area, and as a result, Nendrum declines. Nendrum has also shown that it is the centre of literacy, of great literacy as a monastery. And here we have to think, were there any women in this community or not, apart from the women who might have been on the lands owned by the monastery. Okay, we'll go to the next. So, where do women fit in society? Well, yesterday I was reading this law tract, Chorus Beascana, which is a law tract on the church, and I thought I really should show you where we were with women in the laws. So it is describing different types of contracts, what they call advantageous, good contracts, and disadvantageous contracts that are not good or are difficult. And over and over again, and this comes up in the law tracts throughout, women are classified with the lowest of the vassals or subject people in the church. So they're the people labouring on the land. People who run away from their kin group, so they are outside the kin and are just regarded as really as exiles from their kin. Boys who obviously have not reached the age of adulthood. Unwise persons, deranged persons, they make a list of people who are not reliable. And in the middle of it, women. No contract is held fast on them without their true superiors sanctioning their contract. So in other words, they can't fulfill a contract or be a witness without the authority of their superiors. And next slide, please. In the case of women, they're depending on their fathers, their brothers, their sons, and on the church. So to be witnesses, to be party to a contract, ownership of property, their position in society, they need, on the whole, to refer back to their close kin, or in the case of women in the church, to the hierarchies that are above them in the church. Now, this is the view of law tracts, and on the whole, this probably was true. Women were probably, it wasn't easy for them to move. For example, they technically didn't have the right to move unless they were given that right. But we are beginning to see from archaeology and from scientific experimentation, like on isotopic analysis, that in fact you do find women who have moved, and who have moved quite long distances. And also you do find women who act as patrons, for example, to the church, which suggests that in some cases, and it probably depends on status and on the power that they wield within a male society, that they would have had some more flexibility. But certainly those who are in the middle and the lowest ranks do not indeed. So, and there's just an example of a manuscript with of a law tract, just to give you an example. I should say that the law tracts themselves are mainly preserved in later manuscripts from dating from the 15th century, particularly to the 17th century onwards, by a professional class of lawyers. And speaking of the professional classes, I mean, lawyers, judges, historians, we on occasion, very rarely, find a reference to a woman who might be a poet. But whether they are written out of the story or not, it's not clear what literacy is like among women of the period. Certainly, they are far and few between, and there have been attempts to see if some texts were perhaps written by women, but it is really difficult to establish that. Certainly from the authors that we mainly know, they're all male. Now, next, please. So what are the main roles of women as we see from the sources, and also, I should say, from the archaeology? Well, in any society, childbearing is a big part of it. Women of all classes, of any status, and especially we're thinking from very young women in our context, women, girls from the age of 14 onwards, becoming childbearing and bearing children. And we have to think, in a society like that, where you will encounter violence, famine, disease, you expect that both mothers and children are in danger all the time. And I will show you some archaeological evidence that's coming through on childbearing. So anyway, childbearing. Their work, domestic work, as I said, weaving the cloth that's required for clothes, for the household. And sometimes this is regarded as highly prestigious. So you'll find references to queens embroidering. Now, we do find tiny little bits and fragments of cloth, not much, and more of it from the towns, or a little bit from the chronogs, where you would find the organic material. Also, well, you do have leather working, but it's not clear whether you probably have men and women, and you find hundreds of shoes, for example, from the excavations in Dublin. Obviously, they're providing food, and they're involved in keeping the household. And again, that depends on who you are as a woman. If you are just keeping a very basic household, which may be a very basic dwelling, then your provision of food is as much to do with having food around, perhaps growing food, and vegetables and herbs and so on. So it is both male and female, really, who are involved in provision of food and of fuel, collecting wood, for example, in domestic work. Agricultural work, women are involved in that as well as labourers, and particularly in the lower classes. They are regarded as being out in the fields as much as any man. And they may have been quite often involved in quite heavy manual work as well. We know that they're involved in dairying, and in fact the life of Bríchid, very much that comes through, where her mother and she herself, they're making butter, they're churning and so on. So they're providing food, I presume forms of cheese, through dairying and dairy products. They're also obviously involved in milling, and you will find millstones or grinding stones, querns, I should say, on many Irish early medieval sites, both what we would call secular and ecclesiastical. So you go from the industrial type of milling, as you find in Nendrum and in other sites, down to the very domestic milling of the small quernstone, which is very common. And you do find in the literature, in the sagas, for example, women grinding corn, and even slave girls grinding corn. And women, as I said, are involved in cloth making and in, as I said, embroidery and so on. Now, unfortunately, they're also involved in warfare. This is an endemically violent society. We can see from the burial record, women with very traumatic injuries that have been presumably killed them. They have been killed in war. And we also have, of course, the Oath of None of Iona's Lex Innocentium, which is actually to protect women, children and clerics from combat, because he could see all what was happening around him, obviously, in women and children being killed. And this is renewed a few times, so that when you come to around the 10th century, there's an introduction to the renewed Lex Innocentium, which is actually quite traumatic to read, of Oath of None's mother saying, look around you, look at what's happening. And the description is quite traumatic and bloody, actually. So unfortunately, women are involved in warfare, or are dragged into warfare. Now that may reduce, we're not sure, as the provincial kings have increasingly standing professional armies, that you may not have as many women involved in combat, whatever about being dragged in, or as, what they call nowadays collateral damage, as being killed due to military campaigns. Now, women are also given to the church. And I will go through the type of women who become nuns in a minute. And I think Deborah will be dealing with healing and nursing. You have women involved in the nursing of patients, of sick people, obviously involved in nursing children, and also involved in healing practices. I mean, you do have a professional medical group or class, but you find in some of the law tracts on the sidelines references to women involved in what we might call sort of unofficial healing. It's what you expect, healing with herbs, healing with various magical charms and so on. But women are very much central to the nursing and healing activities. Now, if I can go on to queens, the next slide. So the queens and noblewomen, or the aristocracy, well, obviously she has to produce children for her king or her nobleman. They are in charge of households, and they can be quite large households. And they're also, as well, if you're at the top, you're on the move all the time. So you will be moving from residence to residence, depending, for example, on the season or who the king wishes to see or to exact a tribute from. So they're fairly mobile, and the household might consist not just of the one official wife, but also of concubines or other women in the household who give birth to the husband's children as well. And you have a lot of sagas about the jealousies that happen there. Even you find it in the life of Brigid, where the official queen is very jealous of Brigid's mother, who's a hostage, who's called a slave. I think she's probably not a slave at the lower order, but a slave who's a hostage, who is pregnant by her husband. And she wants this woman to be sent away from the household. They also are very important in alliances, political alliances, and we'll have a look now in a minute at an example. And they are also patrons. Increasingly, as we go through the centuries, you see them as patrons of the church, patrons who, for their own salvation, give something to the church. For example, they might patronize the building of a church or cloth or something like that. And you see that there are more instances of that coming as you come to the 12th century. And the examples that we have come from, obviously, the sagas and the tales, from history, from the annals, and from the Bán Hanachas. So we'll go and look at one particularly interesting lady. The next, this is a woman called Lan, who dies in 890 in the monastery of Clonmacnoise. She's the daughter of a local regional king. She's the daughter of Dungal. And her father obviously marries her off in the first round to a king that is also of slightly lower. Well, he's about the same status as her father, a kind of regional king. Powerful enough because he's like her father in a kingdom that's between large kingdoms, so they're kind of buffer kingdoms. So he marries her off to Gwaithine, king of the Laoise, and she has a son by Gwaithine. Then Gwaithine is put aside, and Lan is married then to the King of Ireland, Muelachlin, King of Ireland. Now, who decides this is unclear. Whether Muelachlin sees her as useful because Gwaithine is fairly powerful regionally, or whether it's her father who decides, okay, Gwaithine, off you go, I'm going to marry her to Lan, because clearly Gwaithine isn't dead, so she's not a widow. Anyway, Lan is married off then to Muelachlin, King of Ireland. And she has a son who becomes the very powerful King of Ireland, Flann Siúna. And I'll come back to Muelwira there in a minute. And then Muelachlin, King of Ireland, dies. And he's from the Midlands of Ireland. And she is married off then as the widow of the King of Ireland, which is a common thing to happen, not only in Ireland, but elsewhere, where the widow of the great king is then married to the next pretender to the title. And Ead Finliath is King of Ireland from the northern part of Ireland. And Ead has 3 wives. The first one is fairly local. She's the daughter of the King of Ullid, northeast of Ireland. The second is quite prestigious. She is Muelwira, daughter of the King of the Scots and the Picts, so she's from Scotland. And then Muelwira is put aside, and he marries Lan as the widow of Muelachlin. But bizarrely, her son, Flann Siúna, then marries Muelwira. So these interconnecting, amazing connections, and most of it is to do with political alliances. So Lan is in the middle of all this pawn, and there's a greater story as well beyond that, but this is the crux of it, where she is literally a pawn in alliances between the great kings of Ireland at the time. Now, but Lan is interesting as well because, and I won't read the next slide, please. I won't read all of it. I'll just sort of, you can be reading it while I'm speaking. This is a story where it comes from a 17th century manuscript or text, but it does get the gist, the core of what a queen could be up to. So in other words, Lan is involved in, she is a patron because she was building a church to St. Brigid at Kildare, and she had many carpenters in the wood chopping down and shaping trees. So she's a patron of the church and of one of the great monasteries at Kildare. But she's also listening in to what's going on in her household. And this is when she's married to Ead Finliath, and it's about her son. So while she's listening, she's also lobbying or advising her husband what to do, inciting him to gather forces against the Leinster men and also later on the Munster men, who are causing trouble for her husband, and even more importantly for her son. So it's a snapshot of the power a queen might have had in early Ireland, and indeed, as we know, all over with royal families, that she could influence her husband in his strategy, and that she could also keep an eye on her own. In other words, because Éed Findiaid has other children by his other wives, but that she is keeping an eye out for her own son, who is my Lauchlin's son, Flann. So I thought it was a nice little snapshot of how important a woman could be in a royal household. Next, please. I hope I have enough time. So I come to the church, and what we see from very early on in the church is, in the words of St. Patrick, that like everywhere else that is being converted to Christianity, women have a very important part in the conversion, because women, again, as mothers, can influence a family and influence them into converting into Christianity. Also, we find, as here, women as well as men wanting to become virgins of Christ. In other words, to give themselves to the church, or in this case, against her family's wishes, which in an Irish context, she's going against her kin group. And as you see, their fathers, not with their father's consent, but enduring the persecutions and deceitful hindrances of their parents. Clearly, this is a new institution. The daughter would be expected to be given in marriage and would have got a dowry and perhaps made an alliance with another youthful family. They're losing out by this woman wanting to be a virgin of Christ. And you see that widows and those who practice self-denial are among the and widows, probably, unless they were of marriageable age again, were probably okay. But on the other hand, Patrick is saying they are kept in slavery. Those who are kept in slavery suffer the most. So again, you have women who would be hostages, or women who had no status at all, perhaps seeing Christianity as a way out of becoming part of the church. So Patrick is giving a fairly good idea of what's happening during the conversion period to women, and to women who want to become virgins of Christ, of the church. They are really going against their existing kin group and structure of society in wanting to join this new institution. But what happens, of course, is that the cleverer families, next slide, please, they see the advantage of Christianity. They see Christianity is going to take over and going to be a very strong institution. So what you begin to find is that fathers are giving daughters to the church and giving land perhaps to the church for the foundation of a monastery. And then ultimately what happens in this case, where Éire Ninne is bequeathing land to women, that these three veiled women then can hand over or go under the protection of Patrick and Armagh. So what then happens, not necessarily that these churches or where these women are become convents, most of them don't. Kildare is an exception, but they become part of a greater institution, the institution of the Church of Armagh, the Primatial Church of Armagh. And amazingly in Ireland, what we find is that the names of the women quite often survive to this day. So a lot of the parishes in Ireland would have the name of one of the early women of probably the 6th or 7th century, still as the patron of the parish. So it's quite remarkable, I think. I come from a parish where that has happened in South County Dublin, very urban parish, but and very sort of upper class now, village or town now, Dalkey, where the cult is of Begnit, who was a woman who is referred to in the genealogies and seems to have been 7th century, under the protection of Glendalough, the monastery of Glendalough. So this is what happens in a lot of cases. And I say not many of them become actual convents or nunneries, I should say, but the names survive. The churches also survive, but become local churches, proprietary churches, often of a larger monastery or of a larger kin group. Now, if we go quickly to the next, I'm keeping an eye on the time. So here I just wanted to show you how Irish Christianity is very much in tune with what's happening elsewhere and its ceremonies and rituals. There's the famous ceremony of St. Bridget taking the veil, the Bishop Macaulay, what happens according to Cogitosus, one of the early lives, shortly afterwards when her parents wanted to betroth her to a man according to the custom of the world, so she was heading for marriage. Bridget, inspired from above and wanting to devote herself as a chaste virgin to God, so another virgin of Christ, went to the most holy Bishop Macaulay of blessed memory. Seeing her heavenly desire and modesty, and seeing so great a love of chastity in this remarkable maiden, he placed the white veil and white garment over her venerable head. And there we see the ceremony of velatio, a woman being veiled or taking the veil, as we have elsewhere, the white garments and the white veil, and being taking the veil under the hand of a bishop. And I should say that having worked a lot on monasticism now for a good few years, bishops are as important in the Irish Church as abbots are. Some abbots are very, very powerful, like Armagh and Ione and Clonmacnoise, but bishops are always there. So it's an Episcopal church as much as it is a monastic church. Next, please. So, and then we have just a quick one here of a holy woman from the life of Patrick. She has an accident as she returned home from the church from night office. So she's following a regulated monastic lifestyle. She has her hip broken, and Columba in Iona hears of this, gives a little pine wood box with a material object in it, and when it's dipped in water, it cures Muchin. And she rejoiced at the coming of St. Columba's representative, thanked him profusely. Then, according to the saint's prophecy, she lived 23 years after her cure and continued in good work. So this is a woman living perhaps on her own, close to a large church, I think it's Clogher, and she is following a regulated life. She's going to a night office, so she's following the canonical hours or the divine office. Okay, next, please. Now, finally, in the church, I come to one of my favourite pieces, which tells of the Abbess of Kildare. This is in the year 909 or 908. Flahertach, who is a joint king of Munster, he's been involved in a battle which he incited, where his co-king of Munster, who was a bishop, has been killed. He obviously been taken hostage. But once his enemy, Carol, the king of the Lycan, is killed, he's being released, and he's been brought to the boundary with his own province of Munster. And how has that happened? Well, Muireann, the successor of Brígid, along with a large group of clergy and many relics, escorted him to Magh Narab, and when he arrived in Munster, he made peace there. So I think what's really interesting is that the Abbess of Kildare leads a procession with this very important hostage to his province, to the boundaries of his province, with her household of clergy and relics. So you can imagine this procession going through the countryside from Kildare across the Midlands of Ireland, headed by this very political and powerful abbess. So I thought this, I always think this is a very colourful kind of picture of a powerful woman in 10th century Ireland, leading her household and her powerful hostage. Now I come at last finally to the poor and the slaves. Next, please. So the poor and slaves, they do obviously turn up in the sources. In the laws, a covel, which is a unit of value, actually means a female slave. So originally, we didn't have coinage until the Vikings introduced it, particularly in the 10th, 11th century. But there are few references to female slaves. There are references to the poor, to poor women seeking alms and so on in the greater churches. You have references to slaves or hostages in wealthy households, milking, cooking, as I said, making butter, tending the cattle and herding pigs, as you have with male slaves. I mean, Patrick is the prime example. And also female slaves and hostages being sexually exploited. For example, Bricshach, the mother of Brigid, and there are other examples. And as I said, the whole problem of war and women being brought in to fight and combat, and they probably were slaves, some of them as well. And also with this whole downward trend in society, people being reduced to servitude, either as servants or slaves of a royal household, or of farmers, middle income farmers, or of the church. So there's that downward push that would bring people into poverty and ultimately also into slavery. Next, please. And of course, the Vikings, and I have here what might be a useful piece by Claire Downham about the Viking slave trade, because of course they're always associated with the slave trade because of the huge network they have. And there is one story, there are a few stories, particularly about Maelcorca from the Laxdale saga, Viking Norse saga, where a farmer, ordinary farmer, goes and buys this Irish girl. She plays dumb and doesn't pretend, who she is. Ultimately, of course, he impregnates her. And then there is the whole theme of the jealousy with his wife. And, you do find references to large monasteries like, and you see above here, Ether, which is Howth on the east coast near Dublin, was plundered by the heathens, and they carried off a great number of women into captivity. I mean, they carry men and women, but this is a specific reference in 821, which is the early period of the Vikings in Ireland. But they are very much involved in the slave trade, and it is likely that women were traded throughout the network. And in Iceland, with DNA analysis, there is some evidence of female Irish DNA, which may be, some of them may be explained partially by slavery or captivity. Now, I just end up with the importance of archaeology. Next slide, please. Archaeology nowadays, because it's scientific, will give you, and because we have so much of it now, is giving us an idea of life expectancy, of the dangers, for example, of childbirth, of instances of famine, of disease and of violence, of deviance, so women who are regarded as, for some reason, outside society and given very strange burials. Burials are particularly important. And also, as I said, the mobility of women, so that we have at least an idea that certain classes of women could move fairly far distances, and from, for example, from Britain to Ireland, or from the east, from the southwest up to the east, and also there's mobility there that we wouldn't have thought about, except that we know, for example, somebody like Lon obviously had to move around with her husbands wherever their residences were. And two very important works on this, with an awful lot of evidence in them, is Elizabeth O'Brien's Mapping Death, Burial in Late Iron Age, Late Iron Age and Early Modern Medieval Ireland, and Eileen Murphy's very interesting paper, which is online, you can get it online, Maternal and Infant Death in Medieval Ireland. And I take just two examples, one from Eileen, next please. A summary of, she takes different, there's more to it than this, I'm just showing you one page of it, of indications of women dying in childbirth or having complications in childbirth. Most of these sites are, yes, all of these sites are early medieval. Maybe some of them would be slightly earlier, late Iron Age. But you will see, you know, that the date range of the women is quite, you have, you know, it's hard to say, of course, a specific date, but they could be as old as 35. And you see the gestation period of the child can be fairly late. And then the different positions of how we know that the woman was to give birth or was pregnant or had given birth is where there is a child or evidence of a child or evidence of a woman in birth position. So you can see here that, for example, childbirth could be particularly dangerous, and I'm sure Deborah will be talking about this, but it's a very useful chart showing you the what science is now telling us about women in early Irish society, and this is increasing more and more because of all the material that we have and how we can approach it through DNA work, through isotopic analysis, through carbon dating and so on, and osteology. A lot of this work is done by osteologists, people who work on bones. And finally, a potential, next please, a potential image of an early Irish woman. This amazing site in County Donegal, on the coast, overlooking the coast. This is a Bronze Age mound, which is reused both in the late Iron Age and the early medieval period. It's what we call a Fertha burial, ancestral burial. In other words, it's on a boundary and it's reused again and again. But in this case, all the burials are female through the whole period, all the periods. It's used as late as the 7th century AD, so we're into the Christian period. One woman, and here she is, I think she looks like a Donegal woman. She's 60, which is unusual. You wouldn't expect somebody, but you do find, not a lot, but you do find people in that age bracket. She's buried in the 5th or 6th century. She suffered from postmenopausal osteoporosis. So we can now tell the diseases that women suffered from, a lot of it, as might be expected, spinal osteoporosis or different forms of osteoporosis, deficiencies in vitamins, in iron and so on. You can work that out. And she's a local woman, and she's clearly of high status because she's given a very specific type of burial. Another woman who is not local, she comes to the northeast as opposed to the northwest, so she crosses the north of Ireland. Very interestingly, she's about 45 or so, and her teeth the osteologists and the doctors who looked, or the medics who looked at her, found that one of her teeth was fairly worn, and they worked out that this was evidence of her putting thread through her gap in her teeth, and that she was probably threading flax thread with the handheld spindle. So I think you couldn't find any closer to real woman in early Ireland than these two, and especially the handheld spindle woman. Thank you very much.
For the presentation. We're traditionally, if you're not in a hurry, we traditionally like to open for some questions, interactions with people who are on YouTube chats watching us. Clarissa is probably going to put some of the questions here. I spotted one already, and if you do not mind, I'm going to read it. Yeah, it's from Elaine, and she had some questions regarding the multiplicity of marriages and consequently various legitimate children. So the first question, she said, would you discuss a bit the concept of polygamy or not in early Ireland? Would men and women have more than a spouse in one single time, or after a divorce or death of a spouse?
Well, I think Edel Bhreathnach has quite an interesting short essay on marriage in early Ireland. There's a volume on marriage in early Ireland. And I suppose you have the term céad mhuintir, so the main wife or the first wife. And I think he's probably right in saying that you had one official wife. So the other ladies, they may be in the household, they were in the household, but the marriage is with this woman. And I think that's what you see with Lán. So you wouldn't have three wives, official wives in the house. You would have an official wife and other ladies who are procreating, you know, who are having children for the husband or the man. So you have that. I mean, there obviously are provisions for divorce, and for example, with Lán, I presume that's what happens with Gaethina. They come to an arrangement, and she's divorced from him and given to Muirlachlan, and obviously then she becomes the widow. And even though Aodh is already married twice and his second wife is still alive, there's obviously again a procedure of divorce, of putting, you know, her aside for the widow. So it's very complicated, and in real life I can't even begin to think of it, because you could be, you know, you could have gone through 3 husbands. And then what you do find, and Anne Connon, I think, has looked at this in looking at women, is that you find competing households. So you would have the sons of Queen number 1, the sons of Queen number 2, and number 3, and the mother could be involved in the competition. You saw how she was involved with Flann Shunna, with her 3rd husband. So they do have more. I mean, I think it's all dictated, and we can only tell about the upper echelons, the aristocracy. I don't think at the sort of middle to lower ranks, economically, they couldn't have had all these households. I mean, there would have been provision for, particularly at the sort of what we call boire, strong, good farmer level, for divorce, but below that, I don't think they could have sustained a large household. So Elaine, yes, they have one spouse at a time after, but then if they want to move on to someone else, there's the provision for the divorce, or obviously the death. But as you read through the annals and the genealogies, my goodness, some of the royal dynasties are unbelievably complex.
She had also asked the second question, which is, what would define a legitimate son to rule a dynasty or kingdom when a ruler had children from different spouses?
It is all to do with politics, I think. So it's quite often it's the one who comes out on top in alliances and in strategy and in military power. Because if you think of it, if we just take Lon as an example, you know, she's married to Moylachlan and she has Flanchina by him. Then she marries Aed and she doesn't seem to have any children by him, or at least that I can remember. She may have a daughter. But then you find with Aed, the third husband, he has important sons by his other wives. So, but Flanchina comes out on top in the next generation, and he comes out on top because of his, you know, his strategic alliances and military prowess. So it is quite often what you find a reference to is to Advari, so to the material of a king. So you could have a whole group of sons who are possibly the heir to the kingship, but either they start killing one another or they get alliances and one comes out on top. And it means that it's quite unstable quite often until you get to the later period. And even in the later period, like the 11th and 12th century, I'm thinking of the O'Briens. I mean, they're forever bickering with one another for the kingship of, well, their own kingship and then the kingship of Munster. So it causes a lot of conflict because they can claim to be legitimate.
I had a question. I mean, I had a couple of questions. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat. If they ask anything, then I'll go back to that. But I would just like to ask you a question out of curiosity, because one of the initial points that you brought up was like the difference between, let's say, this more preeminent but mythological figures, if you can call it like that, like myth, and like I was just thinking that the initial scene of the Toyne, like the story of her and her husband in bed, like the pillow talk episode,
yeah,
and how they're measuring like the properties and all of that. But if we were going to look at more of like a historical analysis, like you're doing, like I was just curious if women in early Ireland, they were able to hold property themselves, and if they did, you were mentioning that unity of value, like the kuval, like someone who is brought into like servitude, who become like a hostage. And I was just wondering, is it possible to think of women also owning kuval, like lords?
Yeah, women can be women of property, but they can't hand it on. Like it reverts back to the kin group, so they can be holders of property, and they could possibly be, to possess a kuval. Mind you, kuval really, as a unit of value, as a female slave, you can see in the law tracts that, in fact, it's just a term for a unit of value. Presumably, units of value are things like cattle and so on. But yes, I mean, I suppose with the difficulty with Medb is that she is so independent, and she is, depicted in this hugely powerful. Well, she is independent and she isn't, in that sometimes she has to bow to Ailill, who's always depicted, or often depicted, as quite weak, a king. But in real life, I don't know that we could have any example. We never have queens, as you would have elsewhere, who actually rule alone. They are always in the shadow of a man. But you do have the provision of women owning, possessing, but it reverts back to their kin group. whatever they own.
Okay. The second question that I had, but this is also just because I really find fascinating the Irish material, even though I'm not, I specialize in the study of Iron Age Britain. And Elaine and I were giving like a workshop on that on Wednesday. And one of the things that I was like introducing to the students was like this huge potential of like the isotope analysis and like the osteology and this idea of creating a osteobiography, like from those models were buried. And I don't know that well the material from early Ireland, but something that we have in Iron Age is grave goods. So I was wondering, like, if like when you were showing that demographic of like those women, like, are they buried with anything?
No,
like, with like rings or anything?
No, very rarely. The Irish don't bury with grave goods on the whole, even right back to the Neolithic. And with Bronze Age, most of it, in fact, all of it, I think, is cremation. So you don't have. And then when you come to Iron Age, we have, and the early medieval period, we have nothing like these spectacular burials and grave goods. Nothing. You're lucky if you find a quartz pebble, and very occasionally you might find a ring, or you might find a part of a weapon or a weapon. What you do find, which is interesting, in relatively commonly, are antler tines, so the tips of antlers turn up in graves of male and female. And which is interesting. We've been trying to work out, is this something to do with healing or fertility or whatever? And some of them obviously are heirlooms, because there's a site in County Kilkenny down in the east, southeast, where it's an Iron Age burial site, and there's there are antler tines found in it with the burials. And then the main burial of the next site next to it, which is more early modern or early medieval, the main burial has an antler tine which is dated to the earlier one. But on the whole, we don't have anything, like nothing.
But that's fascinating in case of like a memory passing like in generations of a practice.
Yeah. And you do, and that whole idea of the ancestral mounds, we have found a lot of them. And in one case, there's a woman, she may be British, we're not sure. Again, she's in one of these, in a reused Bronze Age mound, and she's buried with a horse, which is really interesting. But it's an ceramic, so we don't have pottery. We have imported pottery, and we don't have coinage. Even what we do find, in very bizarrely in Clonmacnoise, the great monastery, a series of male burials with their roast beef, their ribs on their chests. So it's this combination of being buried in a Christian, they date sort of 5th to 7th century, being buried in a Christian rising, becoming important Christian site, and yet they're bringing their roast beef with them to the other world. It's that kind of thing, it's very interesting.
A final question then, if you allow me, you just mentioned the involvement of women in warfare as victims and collateral damage sometimes, like in that case of the Annals of Ulster. I was just wondering, is there any evidence of women perhaps taking more of an active involvement in war, except for basically a role that is not just as a collateral damage, but sometimes
I think so. I mean, that introduction to the later text of the Adamnan Lexinocentium, which is in Old Irish, I think I'm trying to think. You will find that there are a few books about Adamnan's law. That introduction, which is, I don't know, 10th century or so, I mean, that does describe a horror of women in war, actually. And in the burial record, we do find women who are decapitated, and women with, the trauma of battle. So clearly they were actually involved. It seems that yes, they were actually combatants. But I think, as I said, as you move into the more professional form of armies, and these are very much influenced by both Viking and practices, that perhaps that reduces. Yeah, women, they're not mentioned, so that doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Yeah, that's why this archaeological approach is so interesting when you combine it. Yeah.
It's so important, and we have so much of it now. We're only really starting to combine the two, and the more we do, for example, combine the law tracts with what we're finding, and in all sorts of ways, we will get a much better picture. And the more we can, the difficulty, well, it's with the texts and with the archaeology, but the archaeology is running ahead a little, is to be able to define periods, so that you're not just talking 400 to 1200, which is what we used to do, that you're able to say, well, this is what's happening in the 5th to 7th century on the basis of C14 dating or whatever. I mean, the isotopic analysis has its difficulties, and in Ireland especially, because we haven't done, well, I think it may be being done now, the sort of that ground base of the geology of Ireland that will allow for, checking the teeth and the water and all the rest of it. So the base was Britain, and that has caused difficulties, because then you find a high percentage of women who are coming from Britain. Now, they could have, but you wonder whether it's also skewed. So, but I think scientists are more and more aware of, at the beginning, isotopic analysis was the answer to all our questions, but I think it's being more refined now.
Yeah, especially those strontium analysis to see mobility. Yeah, those are amazing.
Yeah.
I'm just keeping a look at the chat, and I think there's a question that Eleni just asked right now. She said, Edel, would you kindly comment more on the all-female burials? Do we know why there were only females on them?
That is one of the most interesting issues, that burial site. I mean, you do find women buried in these ancestral boundary tombs, or cemeteries. But the fact that you have, I can't remember how many, it's almost 10, and they're all women. And we can't say whether the later ones are Christian or not. It's very difficult to tell, because you're in a transition period anyway. So myself and Elizabeth O'Brien have been thinking of this since she excavated a long time ago. Is this some sort of cult, or is it that you will find women buried in these ferta, and indeed men, to claim territory, so that you have a new dynasty coming in? They bury in the old cemetery or mound to say, well, we own this place. And is it in this society that women are used to do that? Because they're not all local. And interestingly, but I think it's maybe stretching or too much, the local lake is called the Lake of the Fair Women. Now, that could be folklore. They hardly knew that there were women buried in. So is there something to do, like fair women or Manafion are belong to the underworld or the other world? So is there something in that? But it is quite stunning that they are all women. and that they go from Iron Age through to the 7th century. So any ideas on that one, and myself and Betty would be very, very welcoming, or would welcome any theories, or if you've parallels elsewhere as well.
Well, that's fascinating. I think we can wrap it up now because we have the time. But Edel, thank you once again for accepting this invitation. It was surely a pleasure for me, and I can speak like in the name of everyone else here. I'm pretty sure everyone was delighted to also have this conference, and hopefully we'll keep in touch.
Yeah, we'll keep in touch, and thank you very much. I hope you got something out of it. Okay.
Definitely. Thank you.
Okay. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.